There was a specific moment in 1998 when the American SUV reached what felt like its absolute zenith. The Grand Cherokee WJ arrived not just as a new model, but as a statement of intent. It was a walking contradiction that somehow made perfect sense at the time. You had a vehicle engineered with the help of Porsche, yet it rode on solid live axles front and rear. It featured a unibody construction that promised the stiffness of a sports sedan, while offering the utility of a farm implement. It felt substantial. The door handles had a certain resistance, and the thud of the door closing signaled a level of luxury we had not seen before from Detroit. But this machine was a tragedy waiting to happen. It was a masterpiece of engineering that was about to be suffocated by a corporate marriage that was never meant to be. To understand how high the stakes were, we have to look at the team that built it. But before we get to the platform teams and the Porsche engineering, we need to talk about what happened to the people who owned one. In 2012, a 4-year-old boy named Remington Walden was riding in the back of a 1999 Grand Cherokee. When the vehicle was rear-ended, the fuel tank ruptured. The resulting fire was a tragedy that would eventually lead to a $150 million verdict against Chrysler. It was the moment the world realized that the engineering compromises we are about to discuss had a terrifying human cost. But here is what is shocking. Chrysler engineers knew about this vulnerability years before Remington's death, and they chose a solution so bizarre it would become one of the most controversial recalls in automotive history. The story does not actually start in the late 90s. It begins much earlier in the shadow of the American Motors Corporation. There is a lineage here that dates back to 1983, with a project known as the XJC. Legendary designers like Larry Shinoda and Giorgetto Giugiaro were sketching the future of the luxury 4x4 long before the market knew it wanted one. This DNA carried over into the Chrysler era under the stewardship of François Castaing. Castaing was a French engineer with a background in Formula One, and he brought a philosophy that would define the best years of the company. It was called the platform team approach. Instead of isolating departments in silos, he grouped engineers, designers, and manufacturing experts into a single autonomous unit. They operated with a level of agility that was rare in the rigid hierarchy of Detroit. They were allowed to take risks, and they were allowed to spend money where it mattered. For the WJ, the mandate was incredibly difficult. The SUV was no longer just for rural utility. It had become the default choice for the suburban family. The new Jeep had to beat the emerging Mercedes M-Class and the BMW X5 on the pavement. But it also had to retain the legendary off-road capability that defined the brand. This is where the hidden hand of Porsche engineering services comes into play. It is a detail that is often overlooked, but it is crucial to the character of this vehicle. The engineers knew that the previous model, the ZJ, suffered from too much flex in its unibody structure. Unlike the Ford Explorer, which used a heavy truck frame with a body bolted on top, the Jeep used uniframe construction. This method welded the frame rails directly to the floor pan. While lighter and more space-efficient, early designs were prone to squeaks and rattles. To compete with the Germans, they needed a structure that was radically stiffer. Porsche was brought in not for marketing, but for hardcore structural analysis. They utilized their expertise in high-performance chassis dynamics to analyze the stress points of the proposed unibody. They helped design a high-strength, steel safety cage that surrounded the passenger compartment. This was about more than just crash safety. It was about the way the vehicle felt as it moved down the road. A stiffer chassis allows the suspension to do its work without the mounting points flexing. It creates that sense of solidity and permanence that we associate with high-end European cars. But here is where we see the first major compromise of the WJ. The team had a Porsche-stiffened unibody, but they made a conscious decision to retain an archaic steering system. While the rest of the industry was moving to rack and pinion steering for car-like precision, Jeep stuck with a recirculating ball setup. This system is fantastic for durability when you are crawling over rocks, because it isolates the steering wheel from hard impacts. But on the highway, it is inherently vague. It has a dead spot on center that requires constant small corrections. So you ended up with this fascinating mechanical tension. The chassis was rigid and responsive thanks to German engineering, yet the steering felt like a tractor. It was capable and solid, but it wandered. The decision to reject independent front suspension was celebrated by purists, but it set the stage for a phenomenon that would terrify owners on the highway. A phenomenon so violent it could break your fingers on the steering wheel. The chassis was rigid, but the technology inside the axles was about to change everything. While the chassis relied on a mix of German rigidity and American agricultural tradition, the four-wheel drive system was something entirely different. It was a technological marvel that arguably has not been surpassed in pure mechanical elegance since. This was the introduction of quadra-drive. To understand why this mattered, we have to look at the past. Previous Jeep systems often relied on viscous couplers. These were essentially canisters filled with a thick silicone fluid that would harden when it got hot from friction. They worked, but they were slow to engage, and over time, they would wear out. The engineers for the WJ wanted something instant and permanent. They developed a system using the CNG 247 transfer case and Vari-Lock progressive locking differentials in both the front and rear axles. But the brilliance was not in the gears. It was in a small device called a gyrotor pump. The concept is fascinating in its simplicity. Inside the differential, the pump is connected to the axle shafts. During normal driving, the pump is inactive. It simply spins along with the wheels. But the moment one wheel begins to spin faster than the other, like when you hit a patch of ice or lose traction in deep mud, that difference in speed drives the pump. It immediately begins to build hydraulic pressure. That pressure pushes against a clutch pack, locking the axle and forcing torque to the wheel that still has grip. It was what engineers call fluid logic. It was a form of mechanical computing. It reacted faster than the driver could think, and it required absolutely no input from the cabin. You just drove, and the machine figured out the rest. It could send nearly 100% of the engine's torque to a single wheel, if that was the only one with traction. It was designed by people who understood off-road driving, but wanted to make it accessible to luxury buyers. However, this level of sophistication came with a heavy price tag in the real world, and the tragedy was that the system was not actually broken. It was just catastrophically misunderstood. The tolerances inside those Vari-Lock axles were incredibly tight. They required a very specific diet of synthetic gear oil and a proprietary friction modifier additive. This created a massive problem, as these vehicles aged and moved into the second-hand market. If an owner took their Grand Cherokee to a generic quick lube shop, the technicians would often fill the differentials with standard gear oil. The system would almost immediately begin to fail. It would not break in a way that stopped the car. Instead, it would bind and groan. When you tried to pull into a parking space, the tires would chirp and the car would shudder. This became known as the quadra-drive whine. One owner on a forum described the sensation perfectly. It sounded like the differential was chewing on gravel. You pull into a parking lot to park, the tires chirp, the axle groans, and everyone stares at you like your car is broken. It led to thousands of warranty claims and frustrated owners who did not understand why their luxury SUV sounded like it was grinding itself to pieces. The tragedy was that the system was not broken. It was just misunderstood. It was a victim of its own complexity. It represented the absolute peak of intentional engineering before cost-cutting measures took over. The team at Jeep had built a system that was arguably too good for the regular consumer. The engineering was sound, and the capability was undeniable. This sophistication, this refusal to compromise, would define the WJ for exactly one moment. Because in 1998, just as these vehicles were rolling off the line, the corporate ground beneath the factory floor was shifting in a way that would undo everything the platform team had built. The launch of the WJ in late 1998 coincided almost exactly with a massive shift in the corporate landscape. In May of that year, the automotive world stopped to watch the formation of Daimler Chrysler. It was announced to the public as a merger of equals. The narrative was seductive. It promised a future where the disciplined engineering of Mercedes-Benz would merge with the daring design and market agility of Chrysler. It was supposed to create a global powerhouse that would dominate the industry for decades. But the reality inside the headquarters was far from equal. It was effectively a German takeover that threw the Auburn Hills offices into immediate chaos right as the new Grand Cherokee was rolling off the line. The impact on the vehicle was swift, and it was detrimental. The culture clash between the two organizations was profound. The Chrysler platform teams had operated with a rare agility. They were small, autonomous units that could make decisions quickly and pivot when necessary. They were used to doing more with less and finding creative solutions to engineering problems. Suddenly, they collided with a formalized German bureaucracy that valued hierarchy and process above all else. Decision-making was paralyzed. The American engineers who had poured their hearts into the WJ found themselves overruled by executives who viewed their methods with skepticism and their suppliers with disdain. The philosophy of the company shifted from product excellence to synergy. The new regime introduced aggressive financial targets to pay for the massive expenses of the merger. This manifested in a program known as material cost management. The WJ became a primary target for these cost-cutting measures. The accountants began to look at the vehicle not as a cohesive luxury product, but as a collection of line items that could be trimmed. This led to a systematic removal of features throughout the production run that the industry calls decontenting. If you track the evolution of the WJ from 1999 to 2004, you can see the physical evidence of this erosion. It started with small conveniences. In 2002, the underhood light was removed. It was a simple feature that allowed an owner to check oil at night, but it was deemed an unnecessary expense. The glove box light soon followed. Then the cuts began to affect the mechanical ownership experience. By 2001, the transmission dipstick was deleted. It was replaced with a dealer-only cap that forced owners to rely on service centers just to check their fluid levels. It was a subtle shift from empowering the owner to creating dependency. The interior, which had been a major selling point at launch, also suffered. The early limited models featured genuine wood trim that added a sense of warmth and authenticity to the cabin. As the years progressed, this was quietly replaced with convincing plastics, or the quantity of the wood was significantly reduced. Roof rack crossbars, which were once standard, became optional accessories. Even the light in the ashtray was cut. Each of these decisions saved the company pennies per unit, but cumulatively they destroyed the premium feel of the vehicle. This created a strange trajectory for the Grand Cherokee. A 1999 model often feels more substantial and premium than a 2004 special edition. The early cars reflect the original uncompromised vision of the platform team. The later cars feel like the result of a spreadsheet. The trajectory of the vehicle was inverted. Usually a car gets better as it ages during its production run. The WJ got cheaper. The boardroom was dismantling the luxury promise one part at a time. But while the executives were squeezing pennies from the platform, something far more sinister was happening on the factory floor. Something that would make the decontenting look like a minor inconvenience. We have to talk about the human element of manufacturing. A vehicle is only as good as the hands that assemble it. In the late 1990s and the early 2000s, Jefferson North became the subject of intense scrutiny that went far beyond standard labor disputes. There is a dark chapter in the lore of this vehicle, a scandal captured by local news crews. Local news filmed workers from the plant spending their 30-minute lunch breaks at a nearby park. The footage showed employees drinking alcohol and smoking marijuana, then getting back in their cars and returning to the assembly line to build Jeeps. While these incidents likely involved a small fraction of the total workforce, the narrative it created was devastating. The scandal fed into a broader perception of inconsistency that plagued the WJ. It raised an alarming question for every buyer who signed the paperwork on a $30,000 SUV? Was the rear differential on your specific vehicle installed by a focused technician, or was it bolted in by someone under the influence? This uncertainty was compounded by the sheer pressure of demand. In 1999, Jefferson North pumped out over 300,000 units. Line speeds were kept incredibly high to satisfy the market appetite for this new luxury off-roader. Former employees and industry analysts noted that this speed often came at the expense of in-station quality checks. When a factory runs at that pace, if a connector is not fully seated or a seal is not perfectly aligned, there is often no time to stop the line to fix it. The car moves on. This rush contributed to widespread early build issues that had nothing to do with engineering and everything to do with assembly. Owners reported water leaks from sunroof drains that were never properly connected at the factory. They found carpets soaked with rain and electrical gremlins caused by loose grounds. It was the reality of owning a vehicle built during a morale collapse. However, the WJ received a strange and grim reprieve from the market forces of the year 2000. Just as quality questions were beginning to surface, its primary rival, the Ford Explorer, became embroiled in the Firestone tire controversy. The news was dominated by reports of tread separation that led to fatal rollover accidents in the Explorer. Jeep marketing implicitly capitalized on this disaster. The WJ, with its lower center of gravity thanks to the uni-frame design and its Porsche-tuned chassis, was perceived as the safer American alternative. Sales remained strong in 2000, partly because families were defecting from the Explorer in droves. It is a heavy irony to consider in hindsight. The WJ was hiding its own fatal safety flaw relating to the fuel tank, which we will discuss later, yet it profited immensely from the safety scandal of its competitor. This created a complicated legacy for the vehicle. Buying a Grand Cherokee from this era became a lottery. If you got a good one, built on a Wednesday by a sober crew, it felt like a world-class luxury vehicle that could rival a Range Rover. If you got a Monday car, you were in for a nightmare of chasing leaks and rattles. The public perception began to shift rapidly. The Grand Cherokee was moving from a symbol of American aspirational luxury to a reliability liability. The build quality was inconsistent. The manufacturing inconsistencies were frustrating, but they were largely cosmetic or electrical. You could live with a water leak. You could live with a sunroof that did not close properly, but these were surface problems. The real crisis was mechanical, and it was far more serious than any manufacturing defect could be. It was hidden under the hood, where the soul of the machine was supposed to live. For decades, the reputation of this brand was built on a simple premise. You could abuse a Jeep engine, and it would bring you home. The old pushrod V8 engines and the legendary inline sixes were cast iron lumps of resistance. They were not refined, and they were not efficient, but they were nearly indestructible. With the WJ, that covenant was broken. The engineers replaced the blunt instruments of the past with sophisticated technology that simply could not handle the real world. The headline act for this new era was the introduction of the 4.7-liter PowerTech V8. On paper, it was a masterpiece, designed to rival BMW. But in reality, owning one was a game of pick your poison. And the cruelest part? The engineers knew exactly what they were building. They just did not care. First, there was the sludge. The engineers designed oil passages so small that if you missed an oil change, sludge would block the flow, the timing chain would go slack, and the pistons would collide with the valves. Second, there was the hydraulic cooling fan. Instead of an electric motor, they powered the fan with high-pressure steering fluid. When the $50 solenoid failed, the fan stopped, the engine overheated, and the aluminum heads warped instantly. It was a leap forward in sophistication, but it came with a fragility that shocked Longsume owners. But perhaps the deepest sense of betrayal came from the six-cylinder models. The WJ was the final home for the legendary 4.0-liter inline six. This engine was supposed to be the cockroach of the automotive world. It was an engine that you could not kill. However, the version found in this generation is infamous for the 0331 cylinder head casting defect. To accommodate a new ignition system and reduce weight, the The foundry produced heads with an exceptionally thin deck surface between cylinder number 3 and cylinder number 4. The thermal cycling of daily driving caused this thin metal to crack. The crack was often invisible to the naked eye, located under the valve cover. Coolant would seep through this crack and mix with the oil, forming a milky emulsion that destroyed the main bearings. Thousands of owners who thought they were buying the most reliable engine in history found themselves with a rod knock at barely 100,000 miles. It was not until late 2002 that Chrysler quietly addressed this. They sourced a new casting from the Tupi foundry in Brazil. These heads added nickel content to the iron and reinforced the crack-prone area. For anyone buying a used WJ today, finding that Tupi stamp inside the oil fill cap is the difference between buying a tank and buying a time bomb. This era marked a profound shift in the relationship between the driver and the vehicle. The WJ demanded a level of mechanical sympathy and strict adherence to maintenance schedules that simply was not part of the Jeep culture before. The abuse-tolerant nature of the American truck was gone, replaced by the temperamental requirements of a high-performance machine. Mechanical failures were expensive, but they were survivable. What we are about to discuss wasn't just expensive, it was lethal. The engineers had made other choices that didn't just break the vehicle, they broke the covenant between the driver and the machine. The most harrowing chapter in the history of the WJ involves the placement of its fuel tank. In a quest to maximize interior space and cargo capacity, the engineers mounted the plastic fuel tank behind the rear axle. It hung low below the rear bumper, utilizing the space efficiently, but placing the reservoir directly in the crush zone of a rear-end collision. This design flaw led to allegations that the Grand Cherokee was a modern-day Pinto. In 2009, the Center for Auto Safety presented data showing that the vehicle was overrepresented in fatal fire crashes. The physics were terrifyingly simple. In a high-speed rear impact, the striking vehicle could slide under the high-riding Jeep bumper and compress the tank against the solid rear axle. The tank would rupture and spray fuel, which would then ignite. The conflict between Chrysler and federal regulators culminated in one of the most bizarre recall solutions in automotive history. Instead of redesigning the fuel system or installing a heavy-duty skid plate, the company agreed to a visual inspection. If the Jeep had a factory tow hitch, it was deemed safe. If it had no hitch, Chrysler would install one free of charge. The logic was that the heavy steel crossbar would act as a beam to absorb impact energy. Critics called it a sham, arguing that a trailer hitch is not a safety device. Millions of vehicles were recalled to have hitches bolted on, not for towing, but as makeshift armor. The human cost of this defect was highlighted in the tragic case of Remington Walden, a 4-year-old boy killed in 2012. A jury eventually found Chrysler 99% at fault for acting with reckless disregard for safety. It was a verdict that cemented the reputation of the WJ not just as unreliable, but as a liability. While the fuel tank issue was catastrophic in specific crashes, the phenomenon known as death wobble was a terror faced by owners in daily driving. Because the WJ stuck with a solid front axle located by a track bar, it was susceptible to a violent harmonic oscillation. As the rubber bushings aged, hitting a bump at highway speeds could cause the front axle to shake laterally. This motion transmitted directly to the steering wheel, shaking it so violently it could break fingers. Chrysler often blamed aftermarket modifications, but the issue occurred on stock vehicles. It was a failure of geometry, where the suspension design simply could not contain the forces it generated once the components began to wear. But if you ask a former owner what they truly hated about this car, they likely will not mention the fuel tank or the suspension. They will scream about the blend doors. The WJ introduced a sophisticated dual-zone automatic climate control system. It used electronic actuators to move plastic doors inside the heater box to mix hot and cold air. The flaw was microscopic. The plastic stop on the blend door axle was too weak for the torque of the electric motor. Eventually, the motor would snap the axle. The result was that the driver would lose all heat on their side while the passenger froze, or vice versa. The official repair required removing the entire dashboard, a 10-hour job costing over $1,000. This excessive cost birthed a vibrant do-it-yourself subculture. Owners developed a method that involved using a Dremel tool to cut a hole in the heater box behind the glove box. Through this rough incision, the broken plastic doors could be extracted and replaced with heavy-duty steel aftermarket parts. It symbolizes the entire ownership experience. A vehicle with premium aspirations, built with cheap components, kept alive only by the ingenuity of its owners. The luxury features continued to turn against the driver. The heated seats, a major selling point for the limited trim, were prone to shorting out. The heating elements would overheat, burning holes through the leather and singing the driver's skin. It was the final insult. The WJ was a vehicle that promised to comfort you, but in the end, it seemed determined to hurt you. The Grand Cherokee WJ stands as the most human vehicle Jeep ever produced. It was ambitious, engineered with the help of Porsche to be the best in the world. Yet it was deeply flawed, a victim of corporate greed and stubborn design choices. It is a vehicle that owners love for getting them through the worst blizzards, but hate for the death wobble and the broken parts. It is the last of the solid axle luxury SUVs, a rugged, dangerous, beautiful relic of a time when Jeep was still fighting for its soul. If you remember driving one of these, let us know your story in the comments. Subscribe for more histories of the things we lost.